Rotarians, guests, ladies and gentlemen, it's my pleasure to introduce our guest speaker today. Peter Ingman, I know, is known to, he's got a fan club here today, and amongst other things, he plays golf with Rob Falconer. I'm not sure if that's an endorsement of any kind, but nevertheless, Rob's prepared to give one. But Peter's, I met him through the South Australian Aviation Museum, and he's been involved with that for many years. But he's also a publisher of books, and he's written he's written a lot, about 12, I think. And there's an array here, if for those of you who have an interest in aviation, you might be interested in having a look. But without any further ado, I'll invite Peter up to speak to you, but he's addressing the RAAF presence in South Australia in World War II. Much bigger than you think, and it came off a very low base. I'll leave it to Peter to tell us why, where and how. Peter Ingman, thank you.
Alrighty, thank you, Steve, for that very generous introduction, and hello everyone. So the talk I'm about to give is based on a book called The RAAF in South Australia that was launched a year ago by the Governor, Hugh Van Lay, on the 31st of March 2021, which is, of course, that was the 100th birthday of the Australian Air Force. And there is a little bit of an interesting story behind that. At the time when the Air Force was launched, it was tiny. I think there was less than 150 people who were members of it, and this compared to the huge numbers that had served in the Navy and the Army, of course, during World War I, and also with all the inherited centuries of tradition that the Army and Navy had from the British services. The RAAF was seen as a bit of a joke. It wasn't really. They were struggling to be taken seriously, and neither the Army or Navy really wanted an independent air service. And back in those days, of course, we basically just copied what the British did. And the Royal Air Force had been formed on the 1st of April 1918, but for a service wanting to be taken seriously in Australia, the 1st of April wasn't the best date to launch them, so 31st of March is the birthday of the Air Force. So yes, Steve mentioned a little bit about me. I'm an Adelaide-based author and publisher. I specialise mainly in World War II Pacific War related titles. I've written 10 and published about 60 others in the last decade. My business is Avonmore Books, a publisher. I'm the chairman of the history group of the South Australian Aviation Museum. So these are my first couple of books that were released about a decade ago about the bombing of Broome and Darwin, which both did very well. And this is a series which I'm currently involved in, which chronicles the air war in the South Pacific, written with Michael Claringbold. And the second volume of this was listed as one of the best global military history books of 2018. So since then we've had a huge global following. I'm also a contracted author for a British military history publisher called Osprey, and they're of course owned by Bloomsbury, which is also the home of J.K. Rowling, but unfortunately I don't quite share her salary scale, sadly. Now, so this is, what I'm going to talk about is very much a sort of a home front history, so just a few questions for you guys to ponder, and we'll get back into these when I finish the talk and lead into Q&A. So what enemy forces, if any, marched to South Australia during World War II? And Steve Larkins is not allowed to answer these because he heard them a week or two ago, but I think he might have known them anyway. One of them's quite well known, the other one not so well. A second question that's sort of connected to all this: what did SA possess back then that was unique and of massive strategic significance to South Australia, or to Australia in general? We had a couple of interesting answers to that one. And lastly, how many members of the RAAF were killed during their service in South Australia during World War II? Certainly, when I commenced research for the book, we didn't really have much of an idea at all, and the answer is quite interesting. So we're going to start off. This is a map of the RAAF establishments in SA. When the war started in September 1939, there was basically nothing here whatsoever. It's not a mistake. Now, this is another map taken from the book. It's a bit hard to see, but basically within a couple of years, South Australia was dotted with RAAF establishments throughout Adelaide and the country areas. We're going to focus mainly on the ones which had big airfields and aviation operations, so Mount Gambier, Parafield, Mallala, Gawler and Port Pirie. So a lot of this stuff for this massive expansion of the Air Force, which happened very, very quickly, was not so much for the Defence of Australia, but for this thing called the Empire Air Training Scheme. And this was a quite brilliant thing that was thought up in the late 1930s in Britain, and they saw that as their Air Force expanded from a few hundred to many thousands of planes, they would need massive numbers of air crews, around 50,000 a year. So with fighter planes, obviously, you need one pilot for each one, but they were also thinking of really large four-engine bombers that might have a crew of 10 or more people. Flying boats had lots of crew, transport planes, all that kind of thing. So they could see there was this massive need, and they could only train a fraction of that number in the UK. Obviously, they have issues with the weather. A lot of their airspace is within range of the German Air Force. So the idea was to do a lot of this training in the Dominions, such as Canada and Australia. And a huge amount of resources went into this very quickly. And all of these bases were sort of set up in 1940 and 1941. So this is Mallala in just north of here, which was home to the largest of these bases. And these things almost sprung up overnight. They were prefabricated huts and hangars that were brought in by rail, and they were put up very, very quickly. This is a base, I think, during 1942 or 43 when it was up and running. The media at that time, they said these things were cutting edge, and there were gymnasiums where people could see movies and all this sort of stuff. But from a modern perspective, it looks pretty austere and more like a Hogan's Heroes kind of camp or something like that. I imagine it must have been obviously very hot in summer and very cold in winter. Now this is Mallala. It was a pretty big deal at its peak. They had 140 twin-engine planes, dozens of hangars, and many dozens of these huts for accommodation and school buildings and so forth. About 2,000 people there, and that compared to the town, which only had I think less than 500. So it had a big effect on those little country towns. Now, where did all the people come from to man these bases? Actually, the biggest of these establishments was in Adelaide itself, not far from here. So the No. 4 School of Technical Training was set up on North Terrace in the exhibition building, which was demolished in the 60s and is now where the Law School of Adelaide Uni is, near the intersection of Pulteney Street and North Terrace. And that's where all the ground personnel and all kinds of other people, mess stewards and dental orderlies, everything you can imagine, they were trained there or in other buildings around Adelaide. The aircrew went to a place called Mount Brecon House in Victor Harbour, which was seen as one of Adelaide's grandest, or South Australia's grandest buildings. It had a golf course there and was a bit of a luxury hotel. So certainly the Army and the Navy must have thought, well, gee, this Air Force gig's pretty good if their first item of business in a war is to take control of this luxury hotel. But this is where all the initial recruits went. They lost their civilian clothes and they did their military drill and also some courses to prepare them for training as either pilots or navigators or gunners and so forth. And then they went off to the bases which actually had the aeroplanes on them. It also trained the WAAFs, the Women's Auxiliary Australian Air Force, and that actually became quite large in South Australia, and sometimes 10 or 20% of the people on these bases were women. So that's one of the graduation photos from Mount Brecon. Parafield, which was Adelaide's main airport in those days, and it was almost a country location really back then, but you can see even back then the hangar line and the control tower is basically as it is today. And Parafield was home to an elementary flying training school which flew these Tiger Moth trainers, and that's where the pilots got their first trainings. They went solo and gained their wings, and that functioned there for 5 years till it became very busy there with other aviation operations, and that school moved to Tamworth. Mount Gambier also had a base, and the RAAF actually had interest there from the pre-war times, and this was where an air observer school was formed. Now, an observer in sort of Air Force parlance, if you like, dated back to the idea in World War I where you had a little biplane with a pilot at the front and a guy up the back who was the observer and sort of the jack of all trades. He might have fired a gun and made sketches of reconnaissance and all sorts of other things. But by World War II, an observer was essentially a navigator, and these flew these Avro Anson twin engine training planes. So there's an Anson flying over Blue Lake in Mount Gambier, and there's essentially the sort of control tower building in Mount Gambier, very basic, but you can see all the airmen there in their flying suits preparing for their day's training missions. So this is quite interesting. It's something we found in the RAAF Museum, which is an unofficial badge that was done up by that No. 2 Air Observers School. And even though they were training, you can see they still saw themselves as doing some warlike stuff. The main thing they have there is a bomb. They have the single wing with the O, which was worn by observer, as opposed to the full wings worn by the pilots. There's a sort of lightning bolt to say they operated radios and so forth. There's a bomb aiming device and also a navigator's instrument. Now, the biggest for these schools was at Malala, which also used these twin-engine Anson training planes, and it was a really big deal. They had about 140 of these things zipping around the skies, and this is where the pilots who got their multi-engine training. So they did their basic training on the Tiger Moths, and then they were deemed that they might fly bombers or large multi-engine aircraft, and they were trained on Ansons. At the peak, there was about 5,000 hours of flying a month, and over 2,000 pilots were trained there during the war. Now, at all these bases, they didn't have hardened runways like we have today. They just basically had big paddocks where they landed in, which was kind of good because the junior pilots might not have lined up so correctly, so they could basically land wherever they liked. But the problem was it became quite difficult. So Malala had a lot of problems with being muddy in the winter and dusty in the summer because there were so many takeoffs and landings that the grass sort of didn't grow. Probably the most interesting school was the one at Port Pirie, which was 2 Bombing and Gunnery School, also known as 2 Bags. And this was quite massive, and it was located there because of its location on the coast. It was suitable for a bombing and gunnery range, which was really massive, and that's why the Army Proof Range at Port Wakefield, because it's lots of mangroves and low tides where you can fire rounds and drop bombs into wet sand basically and recover them. It was suitable for one of these ranges. So this school used these Ferry Battle bombers that dated from the 1930s. They did actually see service during the Battle of France and famously got shot down in great droves. So after that, they became quite useful training aircraft. They were shipped out here and also to Canada. So this is a battle. You can see it had one of these long greenhouse canopies. At the front was a pilot. In wartime, in the middle, there would be a navigator, but for training purposes, in the middle, there would be like a gunnery instructor. And then there was actually room for 3 trainees to fit in the back. And these guys would jump into the little compartment for the day's training. They would all have belts of .303 ammunition around their shoulders, and each one, their ammunition will be dipped in different colours. And they would take turns at firing their guns at another Ferry Battle towing a base, what was called a drogue, which was like a windsock kind of target, and then they would drop the drogue afterwards and see how many colours sort of had formed these holes, and hence award a grade to each of the gunners. And because they could fit 3 of these guys in there, it was quite an efficient way of doing this training. These battles also drop practice bombs as well, and if you imagine someone basically lying prone along the bottom of the plane, they look down through an open thing through a gun sight, and a lot of them got vertigo because it was open to the elements, and also the engine used this glycocoolant, which was quite toxic, and this would get sucked from the engine exhaust and up through this gunnery sight, and a lot of these guys would get really sick, and often these planes landed covered in vomit and so forth. So it wasn't a very pleasant duty, some of this. Now, the other part of this was the planes that were towing, the battles that were towing these targets. They were painted with these high-vis yellow and black stripes, and they wound these targets out using 2,000 sort of feet of cable. Then they would fly various patterns over the ocean while the other planes with the guns approached them, supposedly to simulate fighters attacking a bomber. And that was what they did. Now bear in mind that when you're expanding an air force really, really fast, who are all these dozens of instructors you need? They're actually guys that just graduated from the training a few months ago and did an instructor's course. So what could go wrong? Well, obviously a lot did, with all these planes buzzing around, towing things behind them, and inexperienced pilots. So it was very dangerous. There were some big air-to-air collisions, and the school was closed at the end of 1943, partly for that reason, but also because the training at that time, it had been designed in the late 30s, when there were open cockpits and guns and so forth, and technology had moved on. There were enclosed, electrically operated gun mounts, and also the fighter planes had got a lot faster. So this is a graduation ceremony at Port Perry after that bombing and gunnery school had closed, and they did navigation training. Now there was some wartime operations in South Australia from these training bases. So this is one of the Ansons at Mallala, and it's one of these photos that's been quite cleverly taken with the bombs about 100 metres in front of the plane. So these bombs are only about this big, and they've also got all the wartime stuff, best wishes, Tojo and all that chalked on them, but they were actually pretty useless, it was found, so they wouldn't have done much damage to anyone. But these planes did fly operational patrols around the South Australian coast, mainly to combat the threat from Japanese submarines. One of the other bases that was built in South Australia that a lot of you will be familiar with is Gawler, and this was not a training base, but it was a base that was planned when we really felt the threat of the Japanese invasion moving south. And a lot of the verbal history said it was built by the Americans. Well, it wasn't. It was actually built by the South Australian Highways Department. They got a contract to build it in early 1942. It took them a long time to build it. It wasn't ready till about 18 months later. And this is some of them building it. But they actually built it really well, and for various reasons. One of the runways was bitumen and one is concrete, so that's why you see a white one and a black one. And you can still see that base today when you drive past on the Northern Expressway. It's now used for gliding operations. So there was never any real infrastructure built at Gawler. There was a Kitty Hawk fighter squadron that was based there, and then went to New Guinea. Same with a Voldy Vengeance dive bomber squadron. And also it was used because it had these lovely big runways. These American bombers could fly down there and land, which they couldn't do at Parafield and so forth. So these so-called fat cats would come down and fill up with ice cream and booze and cigarettes and whatever else, and bring all the crews down here for their recreation. Later, this was actually used as Adelaide's main airport. This is a Lancastrian, which was a transport version of a Lancaster, which used to land here in the late 1940s. And that Gawler was used until the West Beach Airport was opened in the 1950s. There were all these bunkers built at Gawler, and this is really weird. People say there was secret stuff going on there, but I think it's just when governments let contracts out at the start of 1942, they're worried about invasion fears and so forth. It takes these contractors a long time to get the materials and the labour to build these things. So there were these big bunkers built up there, but they weren't completed until 1944, when they really weren't needed. Telecommunications unit operated there for a couple of years, but they were really just struggling to use these assets that were never needed. And some of these bunkers still exist today on private property. There was a transport unit, 34 Squadron, that operated in South Australia, initially with these little Dragon biplanes that took about 10 stops to get up to Darwin from here. They were replaced by C-47s in 43, which was obviously a massive increase in capability, and they flew all over Australia and the Pacific from Parafield. There was an RAF squadron that was briefly here in 1945 as well, which actually had 30 of these things based at Parafield, so it was a busy time indeed. There were two radar units in South Australia. One was at Cape Jarvis and one was at Wedge Island in Spencer Gulf. They were obviously protecting the entrances to both those gulfs. They actually weren't really looking for aircraft, but they could detect submarine surface at night, so that was probably the main thing they were looking out for. So I've actually just finished within the 20 minutes, but we'll move on to a couple of these questions. Does anyone have any clue about what enemy forces made it here during World War II. No one brave enough? Yeah, so the first one was actually a German raider that came here in 1940 before there were any of these aircraft patrolling the coasts, and it laid mines at the entrance to Spencer Gulf, and it actually one merchant ship got hit by one of these mines but made it into Port Lincoln. It was repaired. Most of the rest of the mines they washed away because of the big sort of tidal forces moving in and out of the gulfs. And so that first picture is one of these mines preserved in Robe that a lot of you might have seen down there. And the second one is actually a memorial at Beachport where one of these mines was washed up by some fishermen, and a couple of naval sort of demolition people drove down from Port Adelaide, and sadly they got killed in an explosion which when they were trying to detonate the mine. But they were the first two people killed on Australian soil, service personnel killed on Australian soil during World War II. The second time enemy forces came here was a bit of a surprise. This was actually in December 1944 when a German submarine popped up in that same area near Beachport and it attacked a Greek merchant ship. So obviously the war was almost over by that time, and what this submarine was doing down there is another story, but it obviously caused a huge flap with many dozens of aircraft out looking for it very quickly, but it snuck away. Now, this is another interesting question that's sort of connected to all of this. What did SA possess back then that was strategically really significant for the war effort and was not found anywhere else around the country? Yes, sir? I beg your pardon? Sorry. Oh, that came after the war, but that was very important. Radar? No. They were all around Australia, but yeah, it was quite important.
The railway heading north.
That was of some significance, but yeah, it wasn't the core. Telegraph line. No, we had radio by that time. You're getting close. Uranium's actually a good one that's been suggested. Copper was probably found in a few places, but the answer was actually iron ore. We had the only mineable assets of iron ore, but behind Whyalla at Iron Knob and so forth. There was actually another mine up in the Kimberley, but that closed down at the start of 1942 because it was so close to where the Japanese were. So the iron ore, obviously, a little bit of it was used at Whyalla for the smelter there, but most of it went on these ships to Wollongong and Newcastle for use in the steel making going on there. And actually 3 of the ships carrying the iron ore from Whyalla to those ports were sunk off the New South Wales coast in 1942 and 43. So it was actually quite an important thing, and the military they actually put quite a few resources into protecting Whyalla and the three sort of northern cities up there. So this is the anti-aircraft gun emplacement that was situated above Whyalla during the war. And just to finish off, how many members of the RAAF were killed in South Australia? Does anyone want to have a stab at this? It's a bit like lucky numbers. Was it a few? Was it a lot? That's a number that's given for people killed in training in Australia, but I think that also includes some operational flying as well. We actually found there were 147 killed in South Australia during the period to be eligible for the War Memorial Roll of Honour. There's a little war cemetery out at Mallala where some of these guys are buried. There's another war cemetery in the confines of the Port Pirie civilian cemetery. A bit over half were killed in flying accidents, and most of these accidents occurred during the peak of operations in the first couple of years when things were expanding very quickly. The worst accident was when 2 Ansons collided over the Murray River and killed 8 people. There were 5 accidents involving those ferry battle target tugs we mentioned earlier, and most of the other accidents were all the normal stuff, guys, young pilots training in darkness or cloud. And there are actually the things improved in the last couple of years of the war because the standards were much higher, and there was a lot less pressure to get these trainees through. And the rest of the 61 people, others, they were caused by illness and accidents and all sorts of things. But listen, thanks for listening. That winds up the formal talk. But Steve, do you want to take some questions or?
Yes, we'll do that.
Yep.
So, ladies and gentlemen, if you've been out to Malala and noticed, well, I guess it's the now redundant racetrack for cars, that actually occupies the taxiways and so on of the original Malala air training facility. So there's still a footprint out there, you just need to know where to look. Do we have any questions? Mark?
Thanks very much for a very informative presentation. I found this picture really quite interesting and fascinating, that on this one airfield there are more aircraft than there are now in the Royal Australian Air Force right now. Sorry, I'm a former armour officer like my colleague here, so I won't talk ill of the Air Force and work with them. But the question I wanted to ask was, I guess a comment, that Australia really doesn't understand the amount of preparation that we did throughout the country in defence of Australia. We sent lots of people overseas, but we actually put a lot of effort into defending Australia and the potential threat, particularly in the later part of the Second World War. You mentioned the bases throughout South Australia. Were there a lot of other landing grounds that were constructed throughout the state, as there were in northern parts of Australia? And how many? Do you have a rough idea of how many there were, please? Thanks.
Thanks for the question. During the slightly longer version of the talk, and in the book I've actually got one of the maps from the official history which has a lot of these bases at the end of 41 all throughout sort of southeastern Australia, and there were a lot of them. And they all were located in areas basically where there was pretty much flat farmland around there, cleared farmland, because often these planes would have to do emergency landings and so forth. So there were virtually anywhere around there was used for emergency landing grounds, but some of the more better known ones, which were formerly set up in SA, were at Lower Light in Virginia, which were used by the people at Parafield and Malala, but because any farmer's paddock could kind of be an emergency landing ground for a tiger moth or whatever, there were a lot of them everywhere.
And that's one of the reasons where the training facilities were established where they were. So good weather, no mountains, very important. And plenty of flat places and not much tree cover, because you don't need to be hitting them at night either. Any others?
Yeah, thank you for the talk. I'm curious, you've written a lot of books about this topic now, I've been researching it for quite a time. What got you personally interested in this area?
It's a good question. I'm not entirely sure, but like a lot of aviation sort of geeks, I've sort of read all the magazines when I was a kid, and has sort of always been interested and military history in particular. My grandparents actually lived and married in Darwin just before the war, so I've always had a little bit of a curiosity and connection with what happened in Northern Australia during that time.
Looks like Trish has got the floor.
First?
Yep.
Okay. Thank you for that. That was really fascinating. I don't know if I missed it, but all of the people that came to do the training, which I think you said was 40,000 or something, where did they come from?
They were all locals, and it was certainly, there are a couple of different aspects. So all the ones, the aircrew graduates, it was quite a popular thing because it was sort of like the cutting edge technology was to join the Air Force or fly a plane. So a whole industry popped up where mums and dads would buy these SWAT books to sort of SWAT up for all the entrance tests for aircrew. So a lot of people wanted to do it. And the ones that went down to Victor Harbour sort of from SA, they were graded as pilots, and some of the ones that were just missed out and were graded as observers, when they went to the navigation school at Mount Gambier, apparently they were a really rough crew because they were all grumbling that they wanted to be pilots. So yeah, but then there were all these bases all around Australia, so it wasn't necessarily a lateral progression that you'd join at Victor Harbour, then you'd go to Parafield and Malala or Mount Gambier, or some of them were sent interstate, some of them did their initial training and were sent off to Canada, where a lot of them finished their sort of intermediate training. So yeah, it was complex, but most of the ones that trained here were local. some of them were pulled from other states. Obviously, places like Tasmania had a couple of little training schools, but they didn't have the full range, so they sort of came from all over the place.
And the weather's bad, and there's a lot of hills down there. So,
Thank you, Peter.
John. Oh, I'm sorry.
Yes,
there we go.
I think. You mentioned at Mullala the use of drogues for gunnery training was discontinued. When I joined the Air Force in the 60s, they were still doing it for Sabre jet training at Williamstown. Are they still doing that, or was it reinstated? And the other question for my friend Jeffrey here, whose father worked for a long time out at Weapons Research, why was Weapons Research established in South Australia? If you can answer those two questions, please.
Okay, so the first question, which was about the use of the towed targets, obviously they discontinued that. That was at Port Pirie, and it was really just using those ferry battles because they could fly at the same speed and so forth, and having that open gunnery thing. So it wasn't the pilots that were firing at the drogue. It was actually the people in the back of the plane. So yeah, in the 50s and 60s, they still did use towed targets for air-to-air gunnery, where the pilots would be firing the fixed guns at the front of the plane, and that, yeah, probably eventually became virtually out of date, sort of from the 60s or something like that. The second question about the weapons research thing. So pretty much when the war was ending, all these bases, they closed down so quickly, and there was never really any history written. Everyone was just desperate to get back to civilian life. They sort of mothballed Mallala for a number of years, but then they sort of reopened it in the late 40s, I think it was, when the long-range research projects with the UK started. And I think the two reasons for that were, one, we had this massive defence industry out at Salisbury. So there were a lot of trained people who'd been building munitions during the war. And also the sort of Woomera area, I don't know how early they were thinking of nuclear tests, but probably that was an area where they could either do nuclear tests, but also fire ballistic missiles across the desert for a long ways. And probably just that access to that area was the reason. And I think Edinburgh was built in the mid-50s, so that was really when they committed to all that.
John.
Thanks, Peter. When did conscription start for World War II? And were a lot of these Air Force trainees actually conscripts?
Good question. Steve might know that better than me.
Yeah, well, conscription was essentially just into the army. So every eligible male, and the criteria changed, but on the outbreak of war, eligible males 21 to 40, I think it was, were called up, but not necessarily enlisted. So they were warned for service. Then when the Pacific War started, they dropped the age to 18 and extended it to 50, and everybody was pulled into what we would call now the militia. But from there, the militia couldn't serve outside Australia. It's a long-standing element of our Defence Act at the time. So, but the Air Force and the Army that was serving overseas needed lots of young men. So they would voluntarily transfer to the RAF or to the AIF, the Australian Imperial Force, which was authorised by our legislative framework to serve offshore. And bear in mind, as Peter said, most of the Air Force guys in the first couple of years of the war, until the Pacific War started, went to the UK via Canada and places like that. It was massive. And then when the Pacific War started, we had nothing. We had no fighter aircraft. We'd sent all our rifles to England to make good losses from Dunkirk. So it was a very scary time. Right, on that note, I'd like to present Peter with our certificate of appreciation. Thanks very much, Peter.
Cheers.
And we'll retreat to the safety of our table.